The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Valdoria Palace as Princess Elena walked through the grand corridors. Her footsteps echoed softly against the ornate walls, each sound seeming to announce her presence to the ancient stones that had witnessed centuries of royal drama. Today felt different somehow, though she couldn't quite place why. Elena had been part of the royal family for 3 years now, ever since her marriage to Prince Alexander. The transition from commoner to princess had been anything but smooth. While the people of Valdoria had embraced her warmth and genuine nature, the inner circles of the palace remained cold and unwelcoming. Queen Isabel, Alexander's mother and the reigning monarch, had made her disapproval clear from the very beginning. The queen had never spoken harshly to Elena directly, but her silence spoke volumes. During family gatherings, Queen Isabel's eyes would glide past Elena as if she were invisible. During state dinners, the queen would engage everyone at the table in conversation except her daughter-in-law. The message was clear. Elena might wear the title of princess, but she would never truly belong. This morning, Elena was heading to the Queen's private study for their weekly briefing about charitable organizations. It was one of the few official duties they shared, and Elena had grown to dread these meetings. The Queen would sit behind her massive oak desk, reviewing documents with barely contained impatience, as Elena presented updates about various causes she supported. As Elena approached the study, she noticed something unusual. The normally bustling corridor was completely empty. No guards stood at attention, no servants hurried past with silver trays or important messages. Even the sound of her own breathing seemed amplified in the strange stillness that had settled over this wing of the palace. She knocked gently on the heavy wooden door of the study and waited for the Queen's customary "enter." But instead of the formal invitation, she heard something that made her heart skip a beat. It was quiet sobbing, muffled but unmistakable. Elena hesitated for a moment. The Queen was the most composed person she had ever known, someone who had maintained perfect dignity through decades of public scrutiny, political challenges, and personal losses. The idea of Queen Isabel crying seemed almost impossible, but the sound was real, and Elena's compassionate nature won over her caution. She carefully turned the door handle and stepped inside. The sight that greeted her was unlike anything she had ever witnessed. Queen Isabel sat at her desk, but not in her usual rigid, authoritative posture. Her shoulders were shaking, her normally perfect silver hair slightly disheveled, and her hands covered her face as tears slipped between her fingers. Scattered across the desk were photographs, some old and yellowed with age, others more recent but equally cherished. Elena recognized some of them from her first tour of the palace, images of the royal family from happier times, including many featuring Prince Charles, Alexander's younger brother who had died in a car accident 5 years earlier. Elena's heart ached as she realized what day it was. In all the preparations for meetings and events, she had forgotten that today marked the 5th anniversary of Charles's death. The Queen, despite her public composure, was privately grieving the son she had lost. For a moment, Elena considered quietly backing out of the room and returning later. The Queen's grief was deeply personal, and Elena felt like an intruder in this moment of private sorrow. But something about the profound loneliness in Queen Isabel's posture stopped her. Elena had lost her own mother when she was 16. She remembered the weight of that grief, how it could strike unexpectedly even years later, leaving you feeling hollow and alone. She recognized the particular kind of pain that came from missing someone so deeply that it felt like a physical wound. The Queen looked up suddenly, perhaps sensing Elena's presence. For a brief moment, their eyes met. And Elena saw not the formidable monarch who had ruled Valdoria for 30 years, but a mother who missed her child with an intensity that time had not diminished. Queen Isabel quickly wiped her tears and straightened her posture, her mask of royal composure sliding back into place. "Princess Elena," she said, her voice slightly hoarse but attempting its usual authority. "I wasn't expecting you quite yet." Elena could have pretended she hadn't seen anything. She could have offered some polite excuse and discussed the charitable organizations as planned. It would have been the safe choice, the expected choice. But looking at the photographs scattered across the desk and remembering her own experiences with loss, Elena made a different decision. "Your Majesty," Elena said softly, stepping further into the room. "I know what today is." The Queen's carefully constructed composure wavered slightly. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean." Elena approached the desk slowly, her eyes drawn to a particular photograph of Prince Charles, laughing at what appeared to be a family picnic. In the image, Queen Isabel was looking at her younger son with such pure love and pride that it was almost painful to see. "He had your eyes," Elena observed gently, "and your laugh. Alexander has told me stories about how Charles could make anyone smile, even during the most serious state functions." Queen Isabel's breath caught slightly, and for a moment, the barriers between them seemed to lower. "He was going to be an excellent ambassador," she said quietly. "He had such a gift for connecting with people, for making them feel heard and valued." Very different from Alexander, who carries the weight of responsibility so seriously. Elena nodded, understanding more than the Queen might realize. Losing someone who brought such light into the world, it changes everything, doesn't it? Even years later, there are moments when the grief feels as fresh as the day it happened. The Queen looked at Elena with surprise, perhaps hearing something in her voice that suggested personal experience with such loss. "You speak as someone who understands." "My mother," Elena explained simply. "Cancer when I was 16. People kept telling me that time would heal the pain, but what I learned is that time doesn't heal it so much as teach you to carry it differently." Queen Isabel was quiet for a long moment, studying Elena's face as if seeing her clearly for the first time. "I didn't know," she said softly. "There was no reason you should know," Elena replied. "It's not exactly the kind of detail that comes up in official biographies." The room fell into a comfortable silence, broken only by the soft ticking of an antique clock on the mantelpiece. Elena found herself looking around the study with new eyes. She had been in this room dozens of times for their weekly meetings, but she had never really noticed the personal touches that revealed so much about the Queen's private life. There was a small watercolor painting tucked between the official portraits, clearly done by a child's hand and signed "For Grandmama" in wobbly letters. A pressed flower preserved in a small frame sat next to a stack of official documents. A well-worn book of poetry lay open on a side table, its pages marked with countless bookmarks and marginal notes. These details painted a picture of someone far more complex and human than the distant monarch Elena had thought she knew. "I come here every year on this day," Queen Isabel admitted suddenly. "I tell myself I'm working, but really I just sit with his photographs and remember. It's become something of a private ritual." Elena understood the importance of such rituals. After her mother's death, she had spent every birthday at her mother's favorite garden, bringing fresh flowers and sharing stories about her year. "Remembering isn't the same as dwelling," she said. "Love doesn't die just because someone is gone." The Queen's eyes filled with tears again, but this time she didn't try to hide them. "He would have liked you," she said unexpectedly. "Charles always had a talent for seeing the good in people, for finding the heart of things rather than getting caught up in appearances and protocols." Elena felt her own throat tighten with emotion. In all her time at the palace, this was the most personal thing the Queen had ever said to her. "I wish I could have known him." "He would have made you laugh," Queen Isabel continued, a small smile breaking through her tears. He had this terrible habit of making jokes during the most inappropriate moments. During his confirmation ceremony, he whispered to the Archbishop that his robes looked like bedsheets, and I nearly lost my composure completely. Elena found herself smiling despite the sadness of the moment. Alexander does the same thing. Just last week, during the economic summit, he leaned over and told me that the French minister's mustache reminded him of a caterpillar he'd seen in the palace gardens. For the first time since Elena had known her, Queen Isabel laughed. It was a genuine, warm sound that transformed her entire face. Charles taught him that, said that if you couldn't find humor in royal duties, you'd never survive them. They sat in companionable silence for a while, both women lost in their own memories and thoughts. Elena realized that this was the longest conversation she and the Queen had ever had that didn't revolve around official duties or protocol. For the first time, she felt like she was seeing the person behind the crown. "I owe you an apology," Queen Isabel said suddenly, her voice quiet but clear. "I have not been welcoming to you since your marriage to Alexander. I allowed my own concerns about change to overshadow what should have been my focus, supporting my son's happiness and recognizing the woman he chose to love." Elena was stunned. She had prepared for many possible reactions to finding the Queen in this vulnerable moment, but a direct apology was not one of them. "Your Majesty, you don't need to—" "But I do," the Queen interrupted gently. "A good mother supports her children's choices, especially when those choices bring them joy. And anyone who has watched Alexander since your marriage can see that you have brought him tremendous joy." Elena felt tears forming in her own eyes. The acceptance she had longed for but never expected was being offered in this most unexpected moment. "Thank you," she whispered. "That means more than you know." Queen Isabel reached across the desk and picked up one of the photographs of Charles. In it, he was standing next to Alexander at some formal event, but both young men were grinning at something outside the camera's view, clearly sharing a private joke. "Charles always said that the monarchy's greatest strength wasn't tradition or ceremony," the Queen said, tracing her son's face in the photograph. "He believed it was our ability to evolve, to embrace change while honoring what came before. I think he would have welcomed you from the very beginning, and he would have been disappointed in my resistance to change." Elena looked at the photograph and saw something that made her heart ache. Two brothers who clearly adored each other, one of whom would never meet his sister-in-law or see his brother become the man he was today. The morning sun had shifted, casting new patterns of light across the study floor. Somewhere in the palace, the normal rhythms of royal life continued. Meetings were being attended, correspondence was being answered, and the business of governing moved forward. But in this room, something profound was shifting between two women who had circled each other warily for 3 years. "I would like to visit his memorial garden," Elena said suddenly. "Alexander has mentioned it, but I didn't want to presume. I thought perhaps it was meant to be private family space." Queen Isabel looked surprised, then touched. "You would want to do that?" "Very much," Elena replied honestly. I think it would help me understand Charles better, and through that, understand your family better, if you would permit it." The Queen was quiet for a moment, considering this request. Finally, she nodded. "I would like that very much. Perhaps we could go together?" Elena's heart swelled with gratitude and something that felt remarkably like hope. "I would be honored." As they sat together in the study, surrounded by memories and photographs, both women felt something shift between them. The formal distance that had characterized their relationship was beginning to crack, revealing the possibility of something warmer and more genuine underneath. Neither of them knew that this conversation would mark the beginning of a profound change in their relationship. one that would transform not only their personal dynamic, but also have far-reaching effects on the royal family and the kingdom itself. They only knew that in sharing their grief and opening their hearts to each other, they had taken the first tentative steps toward understanding and acceptance. The palace might have fallen still that morning, but something new was beginning to stir in its ancient halls. 3 weeks had passed since that transformational morning in Queen Isabel's study, and the change in the palace atmosphere was noticeable to everyone, though few understood its cause. The Queen's interactions with Princess Elena had shifted from formal politeness to genuine warmth. They had begun taking morning walks together through Charles's memorial garden, sharing stories and slowly building the foundation of a real relationship. The memorial garden was a peaceful sanctuary tucked behind the main palace, designed with Charles's favorite flowers and featuring a small fountain where he used to sit and read. During their walks, Queen Isabel would share memories of her younger son, while Elena listened with the kind of attention that came from understanding loss intimately. In return, Elena began sharing stories of her own life before the palace, her work with local charities, and her hopes for her role as a member of the royal family. These conversations had given the Queen a new perspective on her daughter-in-law. She began to see past Elena's commoner background to recognize her genuine compassion, her intelligence, and her deep love for Alexander. More importantly, she started to understand that Elena's different background was not a weakness, but a strength that could bring fresh perspective to an institution sometimes too set in its ways. However, their growing bond was about to face its first serious test. The crisis began on a Tuesday morning when Elena received an urgent call from the director of St. Catherine's Children's Home, one of the charities she had chosen to support personally. There had been a kitchen fire the previous night, and while no one was injured, the facility that provided meals for 60 orphaned children was completely destroyed. The children were safe but hungry, and the staff was desperate for immediate help. Elena didn't hesitate. Within an hour, she had organized emergency food supplies and arranged for temporary cooking facilities to be set up in the home's gymnasium. She called Alexander to explain the situation, but he was in the middle of crucial trade negotiations that couldn't be interrupted. Without thinking twice about protocol or permissions, Elena decided to visit the children's home herself to oversee the relief efforts. What Elena didn't realize was that her impromptu charity visit would coincide with a scheduled appearance by the Queen at a nearby hospital opening. According to royal protocol, 2 senior royals weren't supposed to make public appearances in the same area on the same day without careful coordination. The confusion led to a media frenzy when photographers realized that both the Queen and Princess Elena were making unannounced visits within miles of each other. The palace press secretary, Lord Hampton, was furious. He had spent years carefully managing the royal family's public image, and Elena's spontaneous action had disrupted carefully laid plans and created exactly the kind of media chaos he worked to prevent. When Elena returned to the palace that evening, she found Lord Hampton waiting in the main entrance hall with a stern expression and a formal complaint already drafted for the Queen's review. "Princess Elena," he said coldly, "your actions today were completely inappropriate. You undermined Her Majesty's scheduled engagement and created confusion among the press corps. This kind of impulsive behavior cannot be tolerated." Elena felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger. "Lord Hampton, with respect, those children needed immediate help. I couldn't sit in the palace knowing they were going hungry while I waited for the proper paperwork to be processed." "That is not how this family operates," Lord Hampton replied sharply. "We have protocols for a reason. Charity work is admirable, but it must be done within the proper framework. Your enthusiasm has consequences beyond your immediate intentions." The confrontation was interrupted by the arrival of Queen Isabel, who had returned from her own engagement to find her personal secretary waiting with reports of the day's complications. Lord Hampton immediately turned to address her. "Your Majesty, I must report that Princess Elena's unauthorized appearance today created significant issues with media coordination and may have overshadowed your own important work at the hospital." Elena watched the Queen's face carefully, unsure whether their recent closeness would survive this first real test. For a moment, Queen Isabel was quiet, and Elena feared that the old distance would return, that she would be dismissed as an embarrassing amateur who couldn't be trusted to represent the family properly. Instead, the Queen surprised everyone by asking a simple question. "Lord Hampton, how many children benefited from the princess's visit today?" Lord Hampton looked confused by the question. "Your Majesty, I believe it was 60 children, but that's not really the point. 60 children who had lost their kitchen and needed immediate help," the Queen continued calmly. "And Princess Elena responded to that need within hours, organizing relief efforts and ensuring they wouldn't go hungry. Is that correct?" "Well, yes. But, and these children, they were grateful for the assistance?" Elena found her voice, despite her nervousness. "They were, Your Majesty. The youngest ones had been crying because they were hungry. The staff said they hadn't seen the children smile all day until the food arrived." Queen Isabel nodded thoughtfully. "Lord Hampton, I appreciate your concern for protocol, and you're right that coordination is important. However, I think there's a larger principle at stake here. This family exists to serve the people of Valdoria, not the other way around. When our citizens, especially children, are in immediate need, our first priority should be responding to that need." Lord Hampton looked stunned. "But Your Majesty, the protocols exist for good reasons, and they can be adjusted when necessary," the Queen said firmly. "Going forward, I want you to work with Princess Elena to establish procedures that allow for emergency charitable responses while maintaining appropriate coordination. We should be enabling this kind of compassionate action, not hindering it." Elena felt overwhelmed with gratitude and relief. Not only had the Queen supported her decision, but she was actively working to change palace procedures to accommodate Elena's style of hands-on charity work. After Lord Hampton left, clearly flustered by this unexpected turn of events, Elena found herself alone with the Queen in the grand entrance hall. "Your Majesty," Elena began, "I want to apologize for the confusion today. I should have consulted with the palace press office before—" "Elena," the Queen interrupted, using her first name for the first time since their conversation in the study. "You did exactly what Charles would have done. He never let protocol stand in the way of helping people who needed it." The comparison to her beloved younger son was the highest compliment the Queen could give, and Elena felt tears forming in her eyes. "Charles once spent an entire afternoon helping elderly residents evacuate from a flooding neighborhood," the Queen continued with a fond smile. "He came back to the palace completely soaked and covered in mud, and Lord Hampton was beside himself about the breach of protocol. But the people Charles helped that day never forgot it. They still send letters to the palace years later, talking about the prince who rolled up his sleeves and carried their belongings to safety." Elena could picture the scene perfectly, and it helped her understand both why the Queen had defended her and why Charles's loss had been so devastating for the royal family. "I want to be worthy of that legacy," Elena said quietly. "I want to use this position to make a real difference, not just cut ribbons and make polite conversation." "I'm beginning to see that you will," the Queen replied warmly. "But Elena, while I admire your instincts and your compassion, I need you to understand something important. This family is under constant scrutiny, and every action we take is analyzed and interpreted by the media and the public. Your spontaneous kindness today was exactly right, but we need to find ways to channel that instinct within a framework that protects both you and the institution." Elena nodded, understanding the wisdom in the Queen's words. "You're saying I need to be strategic about my compassion." I'm saying you need to be smart about it, the Queen corrected gently. There's a difference. Charles learned that lesson too, though it took him a few embarrassing incidents before he figured out how to be both genuine and careful. Over the following days, Elena and the Queen worked together to establish new protocols that would allow for emergency charitable responses while maintaining proper communication with the palace press office. It was a delicate balance, but working through the details gave them opportunities to spend time together and continue building their relationship. Elena discovered that the Queen had a sharp sense of humor and a deep knowledge of Valdorian history and politics. In turn, Queen Isabel began to appreciate Elena's fresh perspective on social issues and her ability to connect with people from all backgrounds. Their collaboration on the new protocols led to longer conversations about the role of the monarchy in modern Valdoria. The Queen shared her thoughts about the challenges of maintaining tradition while adapting to changing social expectations. Elena offered insights about how younger generations viewed the royal family and what they hoped to see from their leaders. These discussions were interrupted one afternoon by urgent news from the palace's head of security. There had been threats made against several members of the royal family, including specific mentions of Princess Elena. While such threats were unfortunately not uncommon, these particular messages were being taken seriously due to their detailed nature and apparent planning behind them. The security briefing was sobering. For the next several weeks, all public appearances would need to be carefully evaluated, and additional security measures would be implemented throughout the palace. Elena would need to adjust her charity work to ensure she was never in vulnerable situations without proper protection. Elena's first instinct was frustration. She had finally found her rhythm in royal life, had begun building meaningful relationships with various charitable organizations, and now she would need to step back from the hands-on work she found most fulfilling. But as she sat in the security meeting, listening to detailed explanations of potential dangers and necessary precautions, Elena realized that her safety concerns extended beyond herself. Any threat to her was also a threat to Alexander, to their marriage, and to the royal family as a whole. Her personal safety had become a matter of national security. Queen Isabel seemed to understand Elena's internal struggle. After the security meeting ended, she asked Elena to join her for tea in her private sitting room. "I know this is difficult," the Queen said as they settled into comfortable chairs near a fireplace. "The loss of freedom is one of the hardest adjustments to royal life. Even after 30 years, there are moments when I long for the ability to simply walk out the front door without considering security protocols. I keep thinking about those children at St. Catherine's," Elena confided. "They're rebuilding their kitchen, and I was supposed to visit next week to see the progress. How do I explain to them that I can't come because someone has threatened to hurt me?" "You don't explain that to them at all," the Queen said firmly. "We find another way to support them without putting anyone at risk. Royal duty isn't just about showing up in person. It's about using your position and resources to help in whatever way is most effective." Elena appreciated the Queen's practical approach, but she couldn't shake her disappointment. "I became part of this family because I wanted to help people. Sitting behind palace walls doesn't feel like helping." Queen Isabel set down her teacup and looked directly at Elena. "Do you know what I was doing when I was your age and newly married to the king?" Elena shook her head, realizing that despite their growing closeness, she knew relatively little about the Queen's early years as a royal. "I was furious," the Queen said with a rueful smile. "Absolutely furious. I had grand plans for modernizing the monarchy, for using my position to champion women's rights and education reform. I wanted to travel to every corner of the kingdom, to meet with farmers and teachers and factory workers and hear their concerns directly." "What happened?" Elena asked, fascinated by this glimpse into the Queen's past. "Reality," the Queen replied simply. "Security concerns, protocol requirements, political sensitivities, and the simple fact that good intentions aren't enough to create meaningful change. It took me years to understand that sustainable impact requires patience, planning, and working within the system even when the system feels frustrating. Elena could hear the hard-won wisdom in the Queen's voice. How did you learn to work within the system without losing yourself? Trial and error, mostly, the Queen admitted, and the guidance of people who understood both the possibilities and the limitations of royal influence. Charles taught me a great deal about that balance, actually. He had a gift for finding ways to make a real difference while respecting the constraints of his position. The conversation was interrupted by Alexander's arrival. Elena's husband looked tired and concerned as he joined them in the sitting room. "I've just spoken with the head of security," Alexander said, settling into a chair next to Elena and taking her hand. "The threats appear to be from an organized group rather than an individual, which means the security measures may need to stay in place longer than initially thought." Elena felt her heart sink. How much longer? "Potentially several months," Alexander replied honestly. "I'm sorry, darling. I know how important your charity work is to you." Queen Isabel had been listening thoughtfully to this exchange. Now she leaned forward with a determined expression. "Elena, would you be interested in a project that could make a significant impact on children's welfare throughout Valdoria while keeping you safely within the palace?" Elena looked up with interest, grateful for any opportunity to feel useful during this period of enforced isolation. "I've been considering establishing a royal foundation focused on child welfare and education," the Queen continued. "It would require extensive research, planning, and coordination with existing organizations. The foundation could provide funding, resources, and royal patronage to dozens of groups like St. Catherine's Children's Home. It would be a massive undertaking, but the impact could be far greater than any individual visit or appearance." Elena felt a spark of excitement for the first time since the security briefing. "That sounds incredible, but surely something that significant would need to come from you, not from me." "Actually," the Queen said with a smile, "I think it would be much more powerful coming from you. You have the passion, the connections with grassroots organizations, and the fresh perspective needed to create something truly innovative. I would be happy to provide guidance and support, but this should be your project." Alexander squeezed Elena's hand, clearly pleased to see his wife's enthusiasm returning. "It's a brilliant idea, and you're the perfect person to lead it." Elena looked between her husband and mother-in-law, overwhelmed by their confidence in her abilities. The project the Queen was suggesting was far beyond anything she had imagined when she first married into the royal family. It was the kind of initiative that could define her legacy and create lasting change for thousands of children. "Where would we even begin?" Elena asked, her mind already racing with possibilities. "With Charles's files," the Queen replied. "Before his death, he had been developing preliminary plans for exactly this type of foundation. His research and ideas could provide a foundation for your work." The offer to access Charles's private papers was deeply significant. Elena understood that the Queen was entrusting her with her late son's unfinished dreams and giving her the opportunity to bring his vision to life. As they began discussing the practical aspects of establishing the foundation, Elena realized that the security threats that had initially felt like a devastating setback might actually be opening the door to something much more meaningful than anything she had previously imagined. The three of them talked late into the evening, sketching out plans and possibilities. For the first time since joining the royal family, Elena felt like she was being offered the chance to use her position for something truly transformative. More importantly, she felt the full support and trust of both her husband and the Queen. Little did any of them know that in just a few weeks, Elena would face a moment that would test everything they had built together and require her to show the depth of her character in ways none of them could anticipate. 6 weeks had passed since the security threats had confined Elena to the palace, and she had thrown herself completely into developing the Children's Foundation using Prince Charles's research. Working with his detailed notes and passionate proposals had given her a profound connection to the brother-in-law she would never meet, and she often found herself wondering what he would think of the directions she was taking his ideas. The foundation was taking shape beautifully. Elena had spent countless hours reviewing Charles's files, which revealed a brilliant and compassionate mind that had understood the systemic nature of childhood poverty and educational inequality. His plans went far beyond simple charity. He had envisioned a comprehensive approach that would address root causes while providing immediate relief to children in need. Queen Isabel had become Elena's closest collaborator on the project. Their daily meetings to discuss the foundation had evolved into deep conversations about leadership, compassion, and the responsibility that came with privilege. The Queen shared stories about Charles's passion for social justice, while Elena contributed fresh ideas about modern approaches to child welfare. Their working relationship had transformed into something much deeper. Elena had begun to think of Queen Isabel not just as her mother-in-law or her sovereign, but as a mentor and friend. The Queen, meanwhile, had come to rely on Elena's insights and had begun discussing her with the kind of pride she had once reserved for her own sons. This growing bond was about to face its ultimate test. The crisis began on a Thursday morning when Alexander received an emergency call from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. There had been a devastating earthquake in the neighboring kingdom of Merida, with thousands of casualties and hundreds of thousands left homeless. King Ferdinand of Merida had formally requested assistance from Valdoria, both in terms of disaster relief and diplomatic support for international aid efforts. The situation was complicated by Valdoria's complex history with Merida. The two kingdoms had been allies for generations, but recent trade disputes and political disagreements had strained their relationship. King Ferdinand and Queen Isabel had maintained cordial but cool diplomatic relations, and there were members of the Valdorian government who saw the disaster as Meridia's problem to solve. But Elena knew that Queen Isabel would never let political considerations prevent her from responding to a humanitarian crisis. The Queen immediately called for an emergency session of the Royal Council to discuss Valdoria's response to the disaster. Elena was not typically included in such high-level political meetings, but the Queen asked her to attend as an observer, given her growing role in charitable initiatives. Elena sat quietly in the council chamber as ministers and advisors debated the appropriate level of response. The discussion quickly revealed sharp divisions within the government. The Minister of Finance argued that Valdoria's resources should be focused on domestic needs. The Minister of Defense expressed concerns about the stability of the region and the potential for the disaster to create security challenges. Several other advisors suggested that any aid should be modest and carefully limited to avoid setting precedents for future requests. Elena watched Queen Isabel's face throughout these debates and could see her growing frustration with the cautious and calculating responses. This was clearly a moment when the Queen felt Valdoria should act decisively and generously, but she was being counseled to respond with political prudence rather than humanitarian urgency. Finally, the Queen spoke. "Gentlemen, I appreciate your various concerns, but we are not discussing a trade negotiation or a military strategy. We are discussing our response to human suffering on a massive scale. Children are sleeping in the rain tonight because their homes have been destroyed. Families are searching for missing loved ones in the rubble of their communities. This is not a time for cautious calculation." The Minister of Finance cleared his throat diplomatically. "Your Majesty, no one questions the humanitarian imperative, but we must also consider our domestic obligations and fiscal responsibilities. A major aid commitment to Merida could impact our ability to fund important programs here at home." Elena felt a surge of anger at this response. She thought about the children at St. Catherine's, about all the charitable organizations struggling for resources, and about Charles's foundation plans that addressed so many unmet needs within Valdoria. But she also thought about what she had learned from Queen Isabel and Charles's files about the moral obligations that came with power and privilege. The meeting continued with increasingly technical discussions about logistics, budgets, and political implications. Elena could see that the Queen was becoming more isolated as her ministers presented practical arguments against the kind of substantial response she clearly believed was necessary. It was during a particularly dry presentation about international law and precedent that Elena made a decision that would change everything. She quietly stood and asked permission to address the council. The room fell silent, as Elena had never spoken during such a meeting before. Queen Isabel looked surprised but nodded for her to proceed. "Your Majesty, honored ministers," Elena began, her voice steady despite her nervousness. "I understand the valid concerns that have been raised about fiscal responsibility and political considerations, but I would like to share a perspective that might be helpful." She took a breath and continued. 6 weeks ago, I learned that threatening letters had been sent to this family, including specific threats against my safety. The security response was immediate and comprehensive, despite the significant cost and logistical challenges. No one in this room questioned whether the expense was justified or whether it might set an inconvenient precedent for future security needs. Elena could feel all eyes in the room focused on her as she developed her argument. The reason no one questioned that response is because protecting the safety of this family is understood to be a fundamental responsibility of the kingdom. It's not a budget item to be debated. It's a moral imperative. She gestured toward the maps and casualty reports spread across the council table. The people of Meridia are part of our extended family through generations of alliance, trade, and mutual support. Their children are sleeping in the rain tonight, not because of political disputes or trade disagreements, but because the earth shook and their homes collapsed. If we have a fundamental responsibility to protect the safety of our own family, don't we have the same responsibility to protect the safety of our extended family when they face a crisis beyond their ability to handle alone? The room was completely quiet as Elena concluded. "I know I don't have the experience or expertise of anyone else at this table, but I do know what it feels like to lose someone you love. I know what it feels like to need help and to be grateful when someone extends it without conditions or calculations. The people of Meridia need our help right now, today, not after we've completed studies about long-term implications or budget projections." Elena sat down, her heart racing as she realized the magnitude of what she had just done. She had essentially challenged the entire Royal Council's approach to a major policy decision, and she had done so as someone with no official authority or diplomatic experience. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Queen Isabel stood, and Elena feared she was about to be dismissed for overstepping her bounds. Instead, the Queen said, "Princess Elena has articulated something I have been struggling to express throughout this discussion. The question before us is not whether we can afford to help Meridia recover from this disaster. The question is whether we can afford, morally and politically, not to help when we have the ability to do so." The Queen's support gave Elena's words additional weight, and the tone of the discussion began to shift. Ministers who had been focused on limitations began talking about possibilities. The conversation moved from whether Valdoria should provide aid to how quickly and effectively they could organize a comprehensive response. Within 2 hours, the Royal Council had approved a massive aid package that included emergency supplies, medical teams, financial assistance, and long-term reconstruction support. The package was far more generous than what any minister had initially considered feasible, but Elena's intervention had reframed the entire discussion around moral obligation rather than political calculation. As the ministers filed out of the council chamber to begin implementing the aid plan, Queen Isabel approached Elena with an expression that was difficult to read. "Princess Elena," the queen said formally, and Elena feared she was about to be reprimanded for her boldness. That was either the most impressive display of diplomatic instinct I have ever witnessed, or the most fortunate accident in the history of royal councils. Elena felt her cheeks burn. "Your Majesty, I hope I didn't overstep." "You did overstep," the queen interrupted with a slight smile. "Completely and dramatically. You challenged experienced ministers, questioned established procedures, and essentially lectured the entire council about moral philosophy." Elena's heart sank, but before she could apologize, the queen continued. "It was exactly what Charles would have done, and it was exactly what this discussion needed. Sometimes the most important voice in the room is the one that hasn't learned to accept limitations as inevitable." Relief flooded through Elena, but the queen wasn't finished. "However," Queen Isabel continued, "I need you to understand that what you did today will have consequences beyond this single decision. You've established yourself as someone willing to challenge authority when you believe principles are at stake. Some people will admire that. Others will see it as dangerous. Are you prepared for that kind of scrutiny?" Elena considered the question seriously. She had spent 3 years learning to navigate palace politics and royal protocol. She had gradually found ways to pursue her charitable interests while respecting the complex requirements of her position. Today, she had thrown caution aside in favor of speaking what she believed to be truth. "Your Majesty," Elena replied, "if I had stayed silent today while people argued about whether we could afford to help earthquake victims, I would have lost respect for myself. I'd rather face scrutiny for standing up for what I believe than regret staying silent when I could have made a difference." Queen Isabel studied Elena's face for a long moment, and Elena could see something shifting in the older woman's expression. It was as if the queen was seeing her daughter-in-law clearly for the first time, recognizing not just her compassion or her good intentions, but her strength of character and her willingness to take personal risks for principles she believed in. "Come with me," the queen said suddenly. "There's something I want to show you." Elena followed the queen through corridors she had never seen before, deeper into the private sections of the palace. They walked in comfortable silence until they reached a small chamber that appeared to be a private office or study. The room was filled with portraits of previous monarchs, but what caught Elena's attention was a particular painting that dominated one wall. It showed a young woman in royal regalia, but her expression was fierce and determined, rather than serene and dignified. "Queen Margaret," the Queen Isabel explained. "She ruled Valdoria 3 centuries ago during the Great Plague. When her ministers advised her to flee the capital to protect herself from infection, she refused. She moved into the palace kitchens and spent 6 months personally organizing relief efforts for plague victims." Elena studied the portrait, impressed by the strength she could see in Queen Margaret's painted eyes. "History remembers her as one of our greatest monarchs," Queen Isabel continued. "Not because she was the most politically skilled or the most diplomatically clever, but because when her people needed her most, she chose courage over safety and compassion over calculation." The queen moved to stand directly in front of the portrait. "I've been thinking about Margaret a great deal lately, especially since we began working together on Charles's foundation plans. I've been wondering what she would think of the modern monarchy, with all its protocols and procedures and careful calculations." Elena waited quietly, sensing that the queen was building toward something important. "I think," Queen Isabel said slowly, "that she would say we've become too careful, too worried about making mistakes and not worried enough about missing opportunities to do good, too focused on protecting the institution and not focused enough on using the institution to protect others." The queen turned to face Elena directly. "What you did today reminded me of something I had forgotten. Sometimes the greatest risk to the monarchy is not bold action, but timid inaction. Sometimes the best way to preserve what matters most about this institution is to risk everything to defend the values it represents. Elena felt overwhelmed by the profound trust the Queen was placing in her judgment and her character, but she also felt the weight of responsibility that came with such trust. "Your Majesty, I don't want you to think that I take lightly the importance of wisdom and experience. I know that good intentions without good judgment can cause tremendous harm." "I know you understand that," the Queen replied warmly. "That's why I trust your instincts." Charles had the same combination of passionate idealism and practical wisdom. He knew when to push boundaries and when to respect them. They stood together in the small chamber, surrounded by centuries of royal history. And Elena felt the full significance of this moment. She was no longer just Alexander's wife or a new member of the royal family. She had become someone the Queen viewed as a partner in the work of leadership, someone worthy of being entrusted with the monarchy's deepest values and most important decisions. A week later, the first Valdorian aid flights landed in Meridia's capital. The response was overwhelming in its effectiveness and unprecedented in its generosity. King Ferdinand himself called Queen Isabel to express his gratitude, and their conversation lasted far longer than protocol required as they discussed not just disaster relief, but ways to strengthen the relationship between their kingdoms. The international response to Valdoria's aid efforts was equally positive. Other nations increased their own contributions to Meridian disaster relief, and Valdoria found itself being praised as an example of humanitarian leadership. Elena's foundation plans, which had seemed ambitious a month earlier, suddenly appeared modest compared to the scope of international partnerships being offered. But the most meaningful response came from the people of Valdoria themselves. When news reports explained that Princess Elena had played a key role in advocating for the aid package, public support for the royal family reached levels not seen in years. Citizens wrote letters praising the princess's compassion and expressing pride that their country was helping those in need. Elena had become, almost overnight, one of the most popular members of the royal family. But more importantly to her, she had earned something that felt even more valuable: the complete trust and respect of Queen Isabel. This transformation in their relationship was about to be demonstrated in the most public and significant way possible. 3 weeks after the earthquake aid had been approved, Valdoria was preparing for its annual state opening of Parliament, the most formal and traditional ceremony in the kingdom's calendar. It was an event steeped in centuries of protocol, where every gesture and word carried symbolic weight. The morning of the ceremony, Elena was in her chambers preparing for the event when she received an unexpected summons to meet with the Queen in the throne room. This was highly unusual, as the throne room was typically only used during the ceremony itself. Elena found Queen Isabel standing near the ancient throne, still in her preparation robes, but wearing a serious expression. 2 senior palace officials stood nearby, both looking somewhat bewildered. "Elena," the Queen said, "I've made a decision about today's ceremony that I wanted to discuss with you privately before we proceed." Elena felt a flutter of anxiety, unsure what kind of decision would require this kind of formal meeting. "As you know," the Queen continued, "the state opening traditionally includes the presentation of new honors and recognitions. This year, I've decided to create a new honor specifically recognizing exceptional service in humanitarian leadership." Elena nodded, wondering where this was leading. "The first recipient of this honor will be you, Elena, in recognition of your advocacy for the Meridian aid package and your work developing the Children's Foundation based on Charles's vision." Elena felt stunned. Royal honors were typically given to people with decades of service or extraordinary achievements. She had been part of the royal family for only 3 years. "Your Majesty," I'm deeply honored, but surely there are others more deserving. There are others with longer records of service, the Queen interrupted gently. But there is no one who has demonstrated more clearly that they understand the true purpose of royal privilege, which is to use power in service of those who have none. The Queen gestured to a small table where an ornate medal and ribbon had been arranged. The honor includes a special ceremony where the recipient kneels before the throne to receive the recognition. It's an ancient tradition that symbolizes the relationship between authority and service. Elena looked at the medal and felt the full significance of what the Queen was offering. This wasn't just an honor. It was a public declaration that Elena had fully earned her place in the royal family and had proven herself worthy of the highest level of trust and recognition. I would be honored beyond words to receive this recognition, Elena said quietly. Good, the Queen replied with satisfaction. But Elena, I need you to understand that accepting this honor means accepting responsibility for living up to it for the rest of your life. People will look to you as an example of what royal service should be. Are you prepared for that? Elena thought about Charles's unfinished plans, about the earthquake victims in Merida, about the children at St. Catherine's and countless others who needed advocates and champions. She thought about the woman in the portrait upstairs who had risked her life to serve plague victims, and she understood that she was being invited to join a tradition of leaders who chose service over safety. I'm prepared, she said firmly. That afternoon, the throne room filled with parliamentarians, diplomats, and members of the nobility for the state opening ceremony. The ancient rituals proceeded according to tradition, with their careful choreography and time-honored words. When the moment came for the presentation of honors, Queen Isabel announced the creation of the new Humanitarian Service recognition and called Princess Elena forward to receive the first award. Elena approached the throne with careful, measured steps, aware that hundreds of eyes were watching her every movement. When she reached the designated spot, she gathered her formal gown and slowly, gracefully, lowered herself into a deep curtsy before the throne. As Elena knelt before her, Queen Isabel felt a wave of emotion that she struggled to contain. Looking down at her daughter-in-law, she saw not just the young woman who had challenged her counsel's timidity, or the princess who had advocated for earthquake victims. She saw someone who had chosen to embrace the most difficult aspects of royal life while maintaining her own moral compass and compassionate heart. The Queen saw Charles in Elena's willingness to challenge authority for the sake of principle. She saw her younger self in Elena's passionate idealism. But most of all, she saw someone who had earned the right to be considered a true daughter, not just by marriage, but by character and choice. As the Queen placed the medal around Elena's neck, her eyes softened with a feeling so profound that several observers later commented on the visible emotion on the monarch's usually composed face. It was pride, certainly, but also something deeper, a mother's love for a child who had exceeded every expectation and proven worthy of the greatest trust. "Rise, Princess Elena," the Queen said, her voice carrying just enough emotion to suggest the depth of her feelings without compromising the dignity of the moment. Helena rose gracefully and looked directly into the Queen's eyes. What she saw there was acceptance so complete and love so genuine that she felt tears threaten to form in her own eyes. The palace had fallen still during the ceremony, with even the usual whispers and movement ceasing as everyone present recognized they were witnessing something extraordinary. It was not just the presentation of an honor, but the culmination of a transformation that had changed both women and strengthened the entire royal family. As Elena stepped back and the ceremony continued with its remaining rituals, she understood that she had finally, completely, found her place in this ancient institution. More than that, she had helped the institution remember its own highest purposes and most important values. Queen Isabel, Watching her daughter-in-law return to her place among the royal family felt a satisfaction deeper than any she had known since Charles's death. Elena had not just filled an empty place at royal events. She had brought new life to ideals that had been dormant too long. In the weeks that followed, as news of Elena's honor spread throughout Valdoria and beyond, the moment when the palace fell still and the queen's eyes softened with feeling became symbolic of something larger than personal acceptance or family harmony. It represented the possibility of renewal, the promise that ancient institutions could embrace change without losing their essential character, and the hope that power exercised with compassion could still inspire and unite people around their highest aspirations. Elena had begun her royal life as an outsider trying to find her way in an unfamiliar world. She had become someone who helped that world remember its own best possibilities. And in that transformation, both she and the monarchy had found something precious: the knowledge that service and love, when genuine and freely given, have the power to transform everything they touch.